This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
I have for you something interesting today. This is a lecture given on a 19th century scholar, theologian, we'll call him, from the other side of the Iron Curtain, given during the papacy of John Paul II. And this is by a cardinal who was often considered by many to be one who would likely succeed John Paul II if his papacy had been relatively short, which it wasn't. So he never got the opportunity to become pope, obviously. This is a lecture by Cardinal Biffi, who was an Italian archbishop and theologian of some great repute. And, well, you might be aware there are certain events going on in Eastern Europe right now, a certain conflict that's been going on for 3 years. And our totally fair and totally free hosts have this rather questionable policy of censoring anybody who mentions that country even by name. So it's a country requested to be consecrated by Our Lady of Fatima, a consecration that I do not believe for a second ever happened. I know that's a hot take for some people, but I know Pope Francis named the country explicitly, but he also named another country, the country they're in conflict with, and it's supposed to be that country and that country alone consecrated by all the world's bishops in union with the Pope, and a release of the third secret. Didn't happen. Anyway, if it had happened, the world would be in a much better place now than it had been before, because it's been 3 years, and we should stop lying to ourselves about this at this point. But there is something interesting in this address here. This cardinal is talking about the Antichrist, and he posits that the Antichrist is here now, and that he is not seen as evil by many people, that he may actually be a public figure walking among us already. That might be hard for some people to swallow, but when you think about the role the Antichrist will play in the final days, what is he going to do? He's going to get everybody in the world to follow him. That would be a hard task for somebody who wasn't at least a known figure already when they attempted to start this. So there's a certain amount of logic behind this. Is the Antichrist among us now? That is a question Cardinal Biffi attempted to answer decades ago. Here he is in his own words. Cardinal warns of Antichrist, as posted by Inside the Vatican and reposted to CatholicCulture.org. A cardinal the Times of London has suggested as a possible successor to John Paul II as Pope has warned that the Antichrist may already be among us, but not seem evil to many. Rather, this fascinating personality, fascinating in the sense of mesmerizing, may be seen by many as a great humanitarian because of his support for things like vegetarianism, pacifism, and the protection of the environment. Cardinal Giacomo Biffi, the 72-year-old Archbishop of Bologna, made his comments in a lecture he gave in March on Vladimir Solzhenitsyn, a brilliant Eastern Orthodox theologian and mystic who has also been cited approvingly by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Benedict XVI. Soloviev said the Antichrist would appear after the 20th century. He said the 20th century would be marked by horrific wars and the demise of sovereign nations. Then the Antichrist would appear. He would call for a one religion via ecumenism, replacing traditional Christianity with an amorphous New Age type of spirituality. His predictions are astonishing in their accuracy, Biffi said, suggesting that Antichrist has already started his work. Vatican watchers think Biffi's remarks significant because they offer a glimpse into the mind of a man who could be John Paul II's successor. Here's Biffi's address on Vladimir Soloviev, a prophet unheeded, delivered in Italian on March 4th in the 1980s, in our own translation. And again, remember, this was given many decades ago. Soloviev in Our Time by Giacomo Cardinal Biffi. Soloviev passed away 100 years ago on July 31st, on August 13th according to the Gregorian calendar of the year 1900. He passed away on the threshold of the 20th century, a century whose vicissitudes and troubles he had foreseen with striking clarity, but also a century which, tragically, in its historical course and dominant ideologies, would reject his most profound and important teachings. He therefore was a teaching at once prophetic and largely unheeded. At the time of that great philosopher, the general view, in keeping with the limitless optimism of the Belle Epoque, foresaw a bright future for humanity in the new century, under the direction and inspiration of the new religion of progress and solidarity stripped of transcendent elements. Humanity would enjoy an era of prosperity, peace, justice, and security. In the Excelsior, a form of dance which enjoyed extraordinary success in the last years of the 19th century, and which later lent its name to countless theaters and hotels, this new religion found its own liturgy, as it were. Victor Hugo proclaimed, "The century was great, the one coming will be happy." But Soloviev refused to allow himself to be swept up in this desacralized vision. On the contrary, he predicted with prophetic clarity all the disasters which in fact occurred. As early as 1882, in his second discourse on Dostoevsky, Soloviev foresaw and condemned the sterility and cruelty of the collectivist tyranny which a few years later would oppress his country and mankind. The world must not be saved by recourse to force, Soloviev said. One could imagine men toiling together towards some great end to which they would submit all of their own individual activity. But if this end is imposed on them, if it represents for them something fated and oppressive, then even if this unity were to embrace all of mankind, universal brotherhood would not be the result, but only a giant anthill. This anthill was later constructed through the obtuse and cruel ideology of Lenin and the leaders of his country. In his final work, The Three Dialogues and the Story of Antichrist, finished on Easter Sunday, 1900, one is struck by how clearly he foresaw that the 20th century would be the epoch of great wars, civil strife, and revolutions. All this, he said, would prepare the way for the disappearance of the old structure of separate nations, and almost everywhere the remains of the ancient monarchical institutions would disappear. This would pave the way for a United States of Europe. The accuracy of Soloviev's vision of the great crisis that would strike Christianity at the end of the 20th century is astonishing. He represents this crisis using the figure of the Antichrist. This fascinating or mesmerizing personage will succeed in influencing and persuading almost everyone. It is not difficult to see in this figure of Soloviev the reflection, almost the incarnation, of the confused and ambiguous religiosity of our time. The Antichrist will be a convinced spiritualist, he says, an admirable philanthropist, a committed, active pacifist, a practicing vegetarian, a determined defender of animal rights. He will also be, among other things, an expert exegete. His knowledge of the Bible will even lead the theology faculty of Tübingen to award him an honorary doctorate. Above all, he will be a superb ecumenist, able to engage in dialogue with words full of sweetness, wisdom, and eloquence. He will not be hostile in principle to Christ. Indeed, he will appreciate Christ's teaching, but he will reject the teaching that Christ is unique, and will deny that Christ is risen and alive today. He sees here described and condemned a Christianity of values, of openings, of dialogue. A Christianity where it seems there is little room left for the person of the Son of God, crucified for us and risen, little room for the actual event of salvation. A scenario, I think, that should cause us to reflect. A scenario in which the faith militant is reduced to humanitarian and generically cultural action. The gospel message is located in an irenic encounter with all philosophies and all religions, and the Church of God is transformed into an organization for social work. Are we sure he did not foresee what has actually come to pass? Are we sure it is not precisely that this is the most perilous threat today, facing the holy nation redeemed by the blood of Christ, the Church? It's a disturbing question, and one we must not avoid. Soloviev understood the 20th century like no one else. The 20th century did not understand him. It isn't that he has not been recognized and honored. He's often called the greatest philosopher his country has produced, and few contest this appellation. Von Balthasar regarded his work as the most universal speculative creation of the modern period, and even goes so far as to set him on the level of Thomas Aquinas. But there is no doubt that the 20th century as a whole gave him no heed. Indeed, the 20th century at every turn has gone in the direction opposed to the one he indicated. The mental attitudes prevalent today, even among many ecclesially active and knowledgeable Christians, are very far indeed from his vision of reality. Among many, here are a few examples. Egoistic individualism, which is ever more profoundly leaving its mark on our behaviors and laws. Moral subjectivism, which leads people to hold that it is licit and even praiseworthy to assume positions in the legislative and political spheres different from the behavioral norms one personally adheres to. Pacifism and nonviolence of the Tolstoyan type confused with the gospel ideals of peace and fraternity to the point of surrendering to tyranny and abandoning the weak and the good to the powerful. A theological view, which, out of fear of being labeled reactionary, forgets the unity of God's plan, renounces spreading divine truth in all spheres, and abdicates the attempt to live out a coherent Christian life. In one special way, the 20th century, in its movements and in its social, political, and cultural results, strikingly rejected Soloviev's great moral construction. He held that fundamental ethical principles were rooted in three primordial experiences, naturally present in all men: That is to say, modesty, piety towards others, and the religious sentiment. Yet the 20th century, following an egotistical and unwise revolution of fleshly desires, reached levels of permissivism, openly displayed vulgarity and public shamelessness, which seem to have few parallels in history. Moreover, the 20th century was the most oppressive and bloody of all history, a century without respect for human life and without mercy. We cannot certainly forget the horrors of the events of World War II, which can never be execrated sufficiently. But it was not only those events. No one remembers the similar events that happened to the citizens of Armenia during the first conflict. No one commemorates the countless lost under Solovyev's own country. No one ventures to calculate the number of souls lost uselessly in the various parts of the earth to establish the hammer and sickle utopia. As for the religious sentiment during the 20th century, in the East, for the first time, state atheism was both proposed and imposed on a vast portion of humanity, while in the secularized West, a hedonistic and libertarian atheism spread until it arrived at the grotesque idea of the end of God. In conclusion, he was undoubtedly a prophet and a teacher, but a teacher who was, in a way, irrelevant. And this, paradoxically, is why he was great, and why he is precious for our time. A passionate defender of the human person, and allergic to every philanthropy, a tireless apostle of peace and adversary of pacifism, a promoter of Christian unity and critic of every Irenicism, a lover of nature and yet very far from today's ecological infatuations. In a word, a friend of truth and an enemy of ideology. Of leaders like him we have today great need. Now, if you'd like to read that for yourself and think about it in the terms of the Fatima message, I'll have a link to it at today's show notes at returntotradition.org so you can read it for yourself on the original website. His message there, I think, is interesting, especially in light of the Fatima message and in light of Catholic prophecy and things. And generally speaking, anybody who in the church hierarchy who opines about these kinds of things will be very educated on, at the very least, what the church teaches about things, which is evident from that reading, as you just heard, but also probably educated on Catholic prophecy, the messages of the Virgin Mary that were given any weight in more recent years. It's an interesting thing to think about in light of what he said there. But I'm curious what you have to say about it, so let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And again, I'll have a link to that at returntotradition.org in the show notes for today's posting. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.